As many of you have gleaned from my videos and statements across the internet, I have a love-hate relationship with the Elder Scrolls series, as I have played all 10 games in the series prior to Elder Scrolls Online and a little bit of ESO. I thought I'd break into Nitpick Land and talk about the things I hate about Skyrim. Number 5. The atmosphere just isn't there. Skyrim, by all reports in previous games, was to be a great frozen landscape. You know, the harsh, bleak place where life is short. Blizzards and snowstorms are all year long. Few crops would grow there, so Nords needed to take what they could by conquest. Whiterun, Snowhawk, Falkreath, Riften, Windhelm, Winterhold, Dawnstar, and Solitude were the great stone fortresses of Nord power. They were all, with the exception of Kaiswathen, or I don't even know how to pronounce that, Ambergard and Litnen, were to be covered in eternal winter. The Reach, leading into High Rock, was really the only hospitable place in the entire province. And it was guarded, basically, because that's where all Skyrim's crops came from. And the idea is Bretons and Nords would fight over who would control that area. And all of that right out the freaking window. Skyrim the game had sprawling, hospitable regions that were more closely resembling Oblivion. And the snowy areas really weren't all that snowy, I'm afraid. Honestly, that's why I find mods like Frostfall so laughable. Vanilla Skyrim doesn't have the atmosphere to make you feel like you're in an inhospitable place that you're gonna freeze at any moment. It doesn't feel like that one bit. So the mechanics of Frostfall feel forced as hell. How should Skyrim look then? Well, grab Enhanced Landscapes by Ace Q, use the Winter Edition. That's how Skyrim should have looked all year long. It's not about realism. Nirn is a fantasy world, and according to all reports, Skyrim should have looked that way on its best day, and used like some kind of snowstorm mod to represent winter. Now, as for Skyrim cities, the Legendary Cities Skyrim Cities mod addresses Falkreath and Morthal, bringing them more into line with what Skyrim City should have looked, because remember, we were looking at Nordic city-states. Each hold was supposed to be a kingdom unto itself. Number 4, the Dragonborn is lame. You know the saying, jack of all trades, master of none? Well, the Dragonborn is the jack of all trades, master of all. Yes, indeed. It was Bethesda's legendary move of removing in-depth character creation. No longer would you have primary, major, minor, and miscellaneous skills that help shape the way your character was. The spin doctors at Bethesda would spin this as a good thing. Your choices determine what kind of character you become. The problem is you never had to make choices. You just had bars that went up based on how fast you used them. The system was designed so that you wanted to use everything for maximum effect and cap out at level 81 as quickly as possible. The result wasn't regular fantasy, it was power fantasy, where you played the godlike mortal, the Dragonborn, and became the master of everything. It's the reason why I made character builds. Because the lack of character definition made those character builds feel mandatory, like I had to impose those artificial rules on the characters so that they would at least feel unique. And you have to admit, my characters did feel somewhat unique compared to the regular Skyrim characters, but that's because I imposed mods on top of that to artificially put classes into the game. Don't get me wrong, but that's the reason I didn't jump all over The Witcher 3. Geralt is Geralt. He is not a character I create. As the Eternal Champion, the hero of Daggerfall, the hero of the Battlespire, and the Neven Nareen, you were actually limited by the character you created. For example, if you created a pure warrior with no magical skills whatsoever, magic was harder to raise. Because it was a miscellaneous skill, it would go up slower. And they wouldn't let you into the Mages Guild until you had painstakingly raised your magical skills to their minimums. That changed in Oblivion, but in every other game before it, the guilds were restrictive. People who wanted to play the power fantasy concept, they'd roll a Spellblade or a custom class to get just the role they wanted to play. It wasn't a problem. The Elder Scrolls as a game series still granted them the freedom to step outside that role, but they had to work hard for it. They weren't the master of everything. They had talents that they defined when they picked the character. And let's face it, acting outside your talents makes you kind of subpar. And it made a lot of sense when you figured it out. In short, that power fantasy isn't what role players are looking for. And with each successive Elder Scrolls game, role players are going to move away from the Elder Scrolls series or stay with the older games. Number 3, NPC AI movement. This is a problem I've had with all Elder Scrolls games, not just Skyrim, but it deserves a spot on my list nonetheless. NPCs live in an invisible stream of movable places known as the nav mesh. Without the nav mesh, they become incapable of moving around. This is a game mechanic that prevents them from moving up and passing through walls. It's basically hard-coded into the game as to how they move. But it's what makes them run around a rock or a log. The problem is the player can jump. The player can move outside of the nav mesh. This enhances your freedom, but it also creates a disconnect between you and NPCs. The player can cross things that NPCs can't. What does this mean? As soon as you cross an invisible threshold like 2 feet up on a rock, the NPC will suddenly stop and go the other way, as if a cosmic force had suddenly reached inside their brain and driven them to go a different direction. You will obey me. You will go that way. In short, stupid AI. It's one reason I can't take the series seriously in terms of combat. Have you ever played Left 4 Dead? The zombie horde had map entities that told them where they could go, but in any official map, they were filled with climbable map entities. That's right. The NPCs could climb up things that you had to painstakingly jump to. If you navigated to somewhere they couldn't run, they would just climb up after you and they'd be faster at it than you were running there. When they were innovating to create Skyrim, more intelligent NPC movement doesn't look like it was on their list. Number 2, Skyrim is more dense. Quote, Todd Howard. Dense is a good way to put it. Skyrim is a tiny, tiny place, and I'm not talking about in comparison to Daggerfall's insanely large, realistic world, where Skyrim was the size of a single kingdom, and there were 50 kingdoms in that play space. That play space wasn't even a whole province. No. I'm talking about compared to the next game up, Morrowind. Let's look at Skyrim's capital versus Vvardenfell's capital. For those of you who don't know, Vvardenfell was the island in the middle of Morrowind. So, Morrowind's capital had 330 unique NPCs. Skyrim's capital had 60 NPCs. 60 buildings in Morrowind's capital versus 13 buildings in Skyrim's capital. Skyrim's capital of Solitude is just 2 streets, a castle and a palace. It's a small place. Let's put it like this. The tiny castle on the side of Morrowind's capital, called Ebonheart Castle, it has more NPCs than Skyrim's capital does. This is horrible in terms of world building. Arena, Daggerfall, and Morrowind all shared one idea. The world is bigger than you. It felt vast, like another world that you would never truly be able to fully explore. But I wanted to try to explore it because there was always something over that next hill, a new Easter egg I hadn't found yet, a new quest to begin. Yes, Skyrim was, and to paraphrase Todd Howard, packed full of content, but it felt pretty small. Honestly, empty fields between settled areas aren't actually as broken and as unused as developers want you to think. They can be used as a pacing mechanism, a spacing tool. I'll get into spacing and pacing later on, but in general, Skyrim needed to be at least 25 to 30% bigger in terms of world space. I don't mean adding more to it, but I mean expanding the size of the province itself. We're talking about between towns, between dungeons, between everything. The play space needed to be bigger to represent that huge area that you were exploring, because you can get to one side of Skyrim to the other in almost no time at all. It didn't feel huge, it didn't feel epic, it felt disappointing. And the number one thing I hate about Skyrim is Nords, Nords, Nords. Have you ever heard of the Nordic Pantheon? Most Skyrim players haven't. It's a well-established fact that Skyrim, the province, had its own set of gods. They did not worship the imperial gods that you worship in Skyrim the game. Completely different. Well, not completely, they shared 2, but let me explain. Shor, Kine, Alduin, Tasun, Shutun, Jarathal, and I'm mispronouncing these horribly too, and Ysmir, as well as Mara and Dibella. Shor was the king of the gods. He was killed by the elven gods, and he's now the ruler of Sovngarde, the afterlife. Now Kyne, Shor's widow, was the mother of men. She created the race of humans. Alduin was the time god, the harbinger of the end of time. Tasun was the god of trials, the shield thane of Shor. He was killed by the elven gods during the Great War that killed Shor as well, and now he guards the bridge in Sovngarde. You can see him in Skyrim, but he is not worshipped as the god he's supposed to be. Shthun, god of ransom, he taught men that killing indiscriminately was a waste. He taught men the benefits of taking prisoners and showing mercy. Jathu, whatever, he's the god of magical science. Alchemy, runes, mathematics were his domain. Mara was the handmaiden of Kyne. As a lesser goddess, she ruled over love and marriage. Now Dibella, she was goddess of arts and athletics, showing people how to thrive during a long winter when they had to stay inside. And finally, Ysmir was the hero god. In life, the Nords called him Talos of Etmora, but he gained the name Ysmir after withstanding the Greybeard's voice and hearing their prophecy. Ysmir founded the Empire, and when he died, they believe he ascended to godhood. Yes, you can claim they abandoned the Nordic Pantheon. You can claim they adopted the Imperial Pantheon, and all that happened between Oblivion and Skyrim during that time. By making any story convoluted enough, you can explain away anything. But what it actually came down to was someone at Bethesda thought it'd be a good idea to water down the Nord culture, only paying lip service to these things, to these previous beliefs, by making them combat shots like, "Shor, have mercy on you!" or throwing in a Temple of Kinnereth. You know, not a Temple of Kyne, but rather Kinnereth. And having them all worship the Imperial gods. It makes it a lot easier because you can basically reuse ideas from Oblivion and make it a stronger connection to Oblivion, which, in my opinion, it did not need. It's something we all overlook, those of us who know a little bit more about the lore. But it will always be my number one nitpick about the Elder Scrolls series. The bastardization of the Nord culture. The fact that we expected from previous Elder Scrolls games was a collection of city-states, each ruled by a warrior king, filled with proud barbarians with a rich culture of their own. Now, what did we actually get? A small collection of villages, each ruled by a politically minded, not very good ruler. The barbarians we expected? More like farmers, merchants, lesser warriors, and a large population of bandits. And finally, the culture we wanted to see more of is just what we saw in Oblivion. It's more or less the Imperial civilization, and the word count was replaced by Jarl. That's basically it. We got more Oblivion. And people wonder why I avoided talking about Nords and my character builds, why I steer away from Nords. It's because Skyrim's Nords are so disappointing. Skyrim lowered my opinion of Nords. Nords were freaking badass in the Elder Scrolls, and Skyrim brought them so low. Skyrim the game destroyed the perception of them. Congratulations, Skyrim developers, you ruined Nords. I don't hate Skyrim, it was just very disappointing. Previous Elder Scrolls games painted a picture that Oblivion failed to live up to, as the Imperial City was to be the largest city in the entirety of the Empire. Each quarter of the Imperial City was to be the size of a regular Morrowind city. Morrowind was the perfect synthesis of size and function. It was smaller than Daggerfall, and it was a little on the alien side, but they did a great job nonetheless. Between size and function. Now, there were many who left Bethesda who worked on Morrowind previously, and what we got was a new selection of developers and a new direction for the team to go in. We got a smaller world for Oblivion, and they claim that the provinces are roughly the same size, but perception-wise, I can tell you that if you go from one end of Morrowind to the other, it feels so much bigger. And if that's because your character is slower, so be it. But honestly, packing it full of content is not the magic bullet. Oblivion still kept the vital mechanics that made Morrowind an RPG, and so too Oblivion was an RPG, although it didn't really live up to the potential showed to us by the earlier games. Things really start to take a downhill slide with Skyrim. Not only is it small-minded like Oblivion, but it disregards far more than Oblivion did. Worse, it's not even an RPG at all anymore. It's an action RPG. It's more apt to call it an action game with very casual RPG elements. What they're doing is streamlining the game. Some people refer to that as dumbing down, and they aren't entirely wrong. Elements are stripped out in order to appeal to a more broader market and therefore get more money. And at the same time, other elements are being added or built up. But in general, the more complex systems have been broken down into something that virtually anyone can just jump into and play. It's more intuitive, yes, but at the same time it's very, very shallow. It's got better graphics, better sound, and better voice acting. I couldn't say that one with a straight face. Than any other previous Elder Scrolls game. But other elements are suffering, and what I think is to blame is vision. If I were to use Bethesda games as a model, I'd say that Bethesda's vision has been narrowing with each successive game. The world is narrowing with their vision, and some really awesome details, and just the general expansive feeling of the world, like the world is greater than you. That idea is fading away with their bad design choices. There are a number of things to both love and hate about every Elder Scrolls game. The problem is while they're building up new things to love, they're also building up more things to hate, and it's not creating a great final product in comparison to its predecessors. I play more Skyrim because it is the most advanced engine the series has produced. The game engine, the gameplay, the modability. It's a great sandbox to play in. And that's what I play it for, is the sandbox. Not for the original game Bethesda developed, but rather for what I can turn it into. And so yeah, I still play it, but this list had to be made, because there are 5 major things I hate about Skyrim.
You have no reason for this! Why not?